Hello everyone, my name is Zhongxuan. Today I want to introduce the requirements engineering in Agile software. So why am I interested in researching on requirement engineering? It's because I read a news in 2018 and the news was posted online said that there's a developer has been asked to implement a requirement. The theme color of the software should match whenever the user changes phone case without the hardware support. And his manager think this should be a relatively easy requirement for him to implement it. But the developer said this is impossible to do. But after that, I started to think about how can those requirements has been posted or has been asked for the developer to implement it? And how can we get a more feasible requirement? So today, I want to cover several topics. First, I want to introduce what is the requirement engineering and why it is important, and what is Agile development. Then I'm going to compare the conventional development versus the Agile development. Then, why do we want to use the Agile in requirement engineering? And most importantly is how to use Agile in requirement engineering. And last but not least, I'm going to do some criticism of the paper that I read. So first, what is requirement engineering, RE? RE is concerned with discovering, analyzing, specifying, and documenting the requirements of the system. In English, it is what do we expect our system to be? The expectation of our system. And in Agile, it could be what the customer wants the system to be. Why is requirement engineering is important? First, the problem in requirement engineering is the most expensive to remove. What I mean by that is if we find out the requirement is infeasible towards the later phases of development, then the cost to fix or remove the requirement is going to be really expensive in terms of budget and time. And secondly, around 37% of the problems occur in the development of challenging system are related to the requirement phases. So as you can see, there is about 37% of a problem will caused by the requirement engineering. So if we can get the requirement engineering done a little bit better, we will save a lot of money and time in the development. Then what is Agile? Agile is really popular software development terminology. Agile means being able to deliver quickly, and change often. This is really simple to understand, but be more particularly, we as software developer team, we want to deliver or frequently deliver the working software to our customer. And in order to measure the progress of our development, the delivery working software will be one of the main things, or one of the main measurements to measure how much of the progress. Third, since we're usually delivering useful software to the customer, and they will feel satisfied because customer will change his mind. What customer wants few months ago might not be what they want right now. Fourth, since Agile is most likely going to using iterations, so we divided the whole development process into several iterations, then we can accept changes in the requirement. Now, let's compare the conventional development versus the Agile. Firstly, the conventional development usually gather all the requirements either from the customer or created by the project manager at the beginning of this whole development process. But the problem is, if the requirement is infeasible, then it's hard to change later in the development phases. And usually, the project manager will decide what is the requirement, how feasible it is, and it will cause some infeasible requirements to occur in the development process. Compare with that, Agile we can add more requirements in the development process since we're doing iterations, right? For each iteration, we can add or modify the requirements that we have. So the change in requirements are welcome. We can change it every iteration. We don't have to get it fixed at the beginning of the development process. And all the team members and come up with those requirements so that the project manager still play an important role to control the topics and the time and probably make some decisions. But also, since everybody is participating in this, it will keep everybody on the same page. We will have a higher chance to get better feasible requirements at the beginning. So far, we already talked about the Agile and requirement engineering separately. Now let's talk about why Agile is important in requirement engineering. There are several benefits. First is flexibility. Infeasible requirements can be changed later, again, since we're doing iterations. Second is accuracy. Produce the software that stakeholder wants. Because we frequently deliver the useful software to our customer, and we usually get the customer involved so that we know what they want in the whole process. If they change their mind, fine, we could change our requirements. Third, iteratively. For every iteration, we can add or remove features, and it's make the process not that hard. Fourth is efficiently. We will always stay on time and budget. We will easily stay on time and budget. We will talk a little bit more or more deeply into it when we talk about the techniques that we can use. Now, let's talk about the techniques for requirement and elicitations in Agile development. The first technique, it's interviews. So interviews is good for getting an overall understanding of what stakeholders do and how they might interact with the system. There are two types of interviews, closed interviews and open interviews. So for the closed interviews, there are going to be a set of a predefined question that we can ask the stakeholder to answer. So we know exactly what we want to know and what the stakeholders want. For the open interviews, it is a no predefined question agenda or a range of issues that we're going to talk with the stakeholders to figure out what they want. So this is the technique that we will use to get a general idea of the project at the beginning. Secondly will be the brainstorming. Since the interviews has the customer involved, the brainstorming will focus more on the team members' involvement. So in the brainstorming techniques, we will generate new useful ideas and promoting creative things in our team. So the new features of the application will be created, will be proposed by each of the team member who has their own thoughts on it. And the project manager play an important role to control the time and the topics. And everyone get a chance to express what their thought is. So all the topics will get together and evaluated by the team as a whole and discuss the connection and dependency of the tasks. So the brainstorming has the team member involvement. Third techniques that's usually used in requirement and elicitation in Agile development is use case analysis. A scenario-based techniques used in UML-based development, which will identify the actors involved in an interaction and describe the interaction itself. So basically, we're just telling out the story of the requirement instead of writing those in some of the language that only the coders can understand. So we want to write out the language that our customer or stakeholder will be able to read. For example, in English, right? We read the requirements in English as a story. Next, after we getting all the requirements elicited, then we want to analyze the requirements, right? The first techniques to analyze requirement will be modeling. We can use a Pamboard, or there are a lot of online software that we can use like Trello, and they will divide the board in mainly three parts. The models to be implemented, model under implementation, and models completed. This layout will provide a visual representation of the project's status, because we know exactly what is the status of each model currently in, so that we can figure out what is the next step is. This is modeling. Second techniques is prioritization. So for each of the tasks or requirements, it should have a priority assigned to it, because there's some of dependency of it. What I mean by that is some of the tasks should be completed before or prior than the other can even get started. So we first must have the most essential or must have requirements in the first iteration. Then after that, we could add another nice to have requirements in the next iteration so that we can get the useful software delivered after the first iteration. The most essential will have the highest priority. For example, if there is something, let's say a software require user to log in or sign up first before they can use the software, so the login and sign up function will probably have the highest priority. The other example probably is the Google Map. The main function of Google Map is to present or display a map on the home screen. Displaying a map and homepage will be the highest priority requirements in that project. And again, the last is the dependency that I just mentioned. So far for the analysis, this is a graph that represents what we will do after we gathering all of those requirements and trying to analyze them. Next is the requirement documentation. One of the main concepts of Agile development is that we try to minimize documentation as much as we can, because usually the early documentation will become irrelevant towards the end of the development process. So the features and requirements are recorded on the storyboard, index card, and paper prototype, like the use case and data flow diagram. Again, like the Trello, which is one of the online tools we can easily manage all of these models, requirements, and you can assign different priority status to each of the requirements. So the documentation is to be used to communicate the requirement between Agile team and the stakeholders, because we want to get customer involved. Again, I'm continually repeating this concepts because this is the most important. We want to get the stakeholder involved. We need to communicate with them to show them some of the documentation will help them to understand what we are doing and help them to figure out what they want. The next stage is requirement validation. This is a very important stage. So the purpose of requirement validation is to make sure that requirements define the system which customer wants. So customer, it's the most important role in this development because we want to get them satisfied. So in order to do that, we need to deliver what they want. And the requirements validation check the consistency, completeness, and realism of the requirements. This is the stage that we will sit together as a team and to talk about for each of the requirements. Are those feasible? Are those good enough to be implemented? Are those good enough to be pushed to the next stage? After doing the validation, we're going to start to think about how to manage all of those requirements we already validated, and mainly three parts. For the management, it must be easy to change, right? We couldn't write them on paper because if we read them on paper, it's somehow hard to change. And easy to access by all the team members. Again, if you write it on paper, where are you going to post those paper? What if someone's getting sick, they can't get to the company, and they will not be able to see those papers? So the paper might not be a good way to manage, to manage all the requirements we get. And it will be easy to store the requirements, priority, time, and progress. All the information related to the requirements should be easily and safely stored at one place. So one of the tools that I had experience on is the Trello. It's really easy to use online requirement management tool. Here are some guidelines for Agile requirement engineering. First is customer involvement. The stakeholder identify the key idea of the project. The stakeholder might not know how to implement all of those because that's the job of our software developer, but they know what they want. They're going to tell us what they want, and we are trying to make it come true. But we need to get the customer involved so that we can satisfy them. We can get the useful software that what they want. Second is frequently released. Since we want to satisfy our customer, we want to frequently release and make some small changes to the software, and the project need to be usable. Third, the requirement elicitation language should be in English instead of using Java, Python, any of the coding language that the stakeholder might not be able to understand. So we can communicate with our customer in English. The early documentation can be irrelevant. So we don't do a lot of early documentation at the beginning. And requirement splitting, it's kind of splitting the complex requirement into several smaller pieces so that we can have a better idea of how much time does it need and what is a priority of each smaller task to make the whole development phase become more manageable. There are several drawbacks of the Agile requirement engineering. First, it requires high individual skill. So for a team, if someone who is lack of skill, and it might create a gap of running on time. And secondly, some of the software need fixed design. It's required by the stakeholder to meet some certain non-functional feature. For example, like security. If Chase are creating a new mobile banking software, I think the highest priority of that software is security because people don't want to lose money if they use this software. And the bank will make sure their money is safe. So they might want to get the requirement fixed at the beginning so they get into the development phases that they will get the most important or highest priority non-functional requirements in place. After reading and researching the paper that I read, there are several criticisms I have about this paper. So first, the paper mentioned that the Agile work better for the small to medium-sized team, but didn't explain why it is not good for big team or relatively larger team. I did a little bit of research on this, and one of the main reasons of it is because the big team is harder to keep everybody on the same page. So I guess the communication between team members for a big team might be harder than a smaller team. And secondly, the paper did not brought up the concept of velocity, which has been mentioned in the supporting material. And it is a key idea. It is a most essential factor to be able to determine the length of the iteration and the time of each task. So it will change a lot of things. Schedule, time of each task, and also the priority maybe. So if you have any question, please send an email to zhs61@pitt.edu. Thank you very much.